Hi da da dee da dee da. Dee da dee da 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 da. Dee da dee da da dee da da dee da. Dee da dee da dee da 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 dum. Good morning, everybody. We are learning in Siman 39 of the Kiddush. We are learning some interesting laws and customs having to do if you're going to eat or drink before a meal. In other words, you're about to have a meal, but you have a Vorspeise, as we used to call it at my house growing up. Some kind of pre-meal food. And the meal, by definition, is something that we're going to be washing for. So we're going to be saying hamotzi. We're going to say on bread, washing and saying hamotzi. But before that, we're going to be eating something. So why would there be any kind of discussion of this at all? First, we just finished 4 simanim, 4 chapters having to do with laws about food preparation. Okay, so that's one. So now we're going to start eating. And before eating and drinking, before eating or drinking, we're supposed to say a blessing, right? Which called a bracha rishona, and on the specific food that we're going to eat, right? So if we're having a beer, we're going to say a shehakol nieh bidvarom, and if you've had enough of that food, it obligates one in saying a bracha achrona, which we call in benching or birkat hamazon, or if it's something that's just a snack or some other kind of food, which is not, there's going to be other bracha achronas, other after brachas. There are 3 altogether, 3 main ones. So, and in Siman 43, chapter 43, we're going to get into some other details about this, about food that's eaten within the context of a meal that might require its own blessing. Now, so the question here is, there are going to be certain circumstances where even foods which are eaten before a meal can be considered part of the meal with regards to the bracha achrona, with regards to saying a blessing after we eat, which would be included in the birkat hamazon that you say. So we're going to look at different circumstances that affect the requirement of a bracha achrona for food that's eaten before a meal. And that's just to sum it up even more tightly with an example. You are invited, to somebody's home for dinner. And before the dinner, the gracious host, they say, would anybody like a glass of wine? So you say, of course, love some wine. So you have a glass of wine. Now, do you have to say a bracha achrona? Do you have to say a blessing on that wine before you sit down for the meal where you're going to be saying hamotzi? Or when you say the hamotzi, is it going to include everything that you were just doing? Is it include the wine, and so you don't say a special bracha achrona or even a bracha rishona? Again, right? You started the wine before the meal. You're going to now have more wine. So that's the case. It's a very specific case, and therefore it's not a very long chapter, but it is very much halacha l'maisa. This is a occurrence which comes up very often. It also, let's say you go to a synagogue and you're at the shul and you start having some of the Kiddush, and then you decide to sit and wash for the meal. Do you have to now say bracha achrona, or can you just wash hamot and say hamotzi? Or do you have to, what do you do? So it's very much a practical chapter, very short, and let's get right into it. So, harotze lechol kotem tiyas yadayim. Let's say one who wishes to eat before washing their hands for a meal, right? So right here, and by the way, later we'll get to chapter 40, and it has to do with the laws of wash your hands. And so right now, you're going to want to eat something before the meal. So that's that first case I said about being invited over for somebody, for dinner. Now, devarim certain types of foods of a type that will also be eaten during the meal, whether they are foods that you would require to bless upon them if eaten during a meal separately, could go on peiros, let's say fruit, or foods that you wouldn't require to say an additional bracha during the meal, could go on mine laftan. Laftan are is a condiment, I guess. Umin kitnyos, or a type of kitnyos. He's got a big Yiddish word here. Verdefafel. We'll get into that. Okay. Okay, so here's the beginning of the case, right? So you're going to eat something. So you got something you're going to eat before the meal. Whether it's something you're going to say a bracha on, if you were eating it during the meal, an additional bracha, or not. Now, this sif specifically, so does not include the subject of borei mine mezonos, bracha, regarding food that was an appetizer. Okay. Additionally, just this idea about certain foods requiring a blessing if they're eaten during the meal, right? We're going to have to go into that in chapter 43, but I'll give you a hint of what it's going to say. And the Mishnah Berurah discusses this and says that when somebody has their table, the table's already set. He says that you should not eat any other foods, but begin the meal with bread. That's like set means that like the food is already out on the table. Okay, not like when we say table set in colloquial English, we mean that there's plate and forks and knives and spoon or whatever implements, cups that you're going to use for the meal. But it doesn't mean that when you say that the table is set, that doesn't necessarily mean that the food is out on the table. And the reason the Mishnah Berurah says you shouldn't do that is because it's such a short period of time. You got everything's there, everything's ready to eat. So you should just eat the food there, and you'll get out of this whole question about what bracha to say when and so forth, or whether to say bracha achrona or not. And he would say that eating in that case, something like a Vorspeise or a glass of wine before the meal started as an appetizer is actually maybe even be considered a bracha levatala, an unnecessary bracha, right? Because you could have just included that bracha with the hamotzi and everything would have been covered. Okay, now back to our regular scheduled text. Let's say you want to drink some kind of beverage, chutz min hayayin, so without wine. Hold the wine idea. I just like having wine before a meal, I guess. That's why I wanted to use that idea. But let's just hold this. You want to have something, a beer. You're invited over, you have a beer. I'm at Doug's. Doug says, want to have a beer before, because the veggie dogs are still cooking on the grill. And but you can have a beer while you're waiting for your barbecue, right? Before you wash your hands, and you plan to drink from that, you're going to have beer during the meal too. There is a differences of opinion between the relevant halachic authorities. Imagine that. There's different opinion of what to do. There's actually a dispute of what to do. Are those items that you ate or drank before the meal, literally before wash your hands, niftarim bebirkas hamazon, are they exempt from saying a bracha achrona when you by the recitation of birkat hamazon at the end of the meal, right? When you say that, when you bench at the end of the meal, does it cover the stuff you had before the meal started? Just as those foods that are eaten during the meal are exempt from birkat hamazon, right? Because if you have a fruit during the meal, you say a new bracha on that fruit because you didn't know you were going to have it, or for example, it wasn't on the table beforehand. You don't add a extra bracha for that. Everything's included in the birkat hamazon. Or do we say that those foods which you ate before washing your hands for the meal, they're not included in the after bracha, the birkat hamazon. So that's the shaila, right? As we explained in the introduction. Now, again, hold the question in mind. Hold the question in mind. And let's try to understand what the kids are getting into here. So, notice that he applies this doubt whether the food in question is a fruit, kind of, and a vegetable, right? Any of these things. And the reason is like this, because some of the authorities rule that even if you're simply eating the same type of food that you're going to eat, you have it before, that it doesn't link it, right? That even that they're separate things. Okay, we keep going. Lchaim, therefore, in a case of halachic doubt, like this, yesh limnoya mizeh. So first he says, don't get into this mess. That's my word, mess. He doesn't say mess. He says, you should refrain from doing this. You should only have those foods that you're going to have during the meal. Only have the ones that you're going to have during the meal, right? So if you want to snack before the meal, have things before the meal that you're also going to have during the regular meal, and not new things that you're not going to have during the meal. And then recite a bracha. Or is he saying, have things that you're not going to have during the meal, right? So, right, you have two options here. If you want to, well, not two, more, but these two options that he presents are like this. You're going to have a snack before the meal. If you have something before the meal that you're not going to have during the meal, so then you get out of that halachic problem that some of the authorities have discussed, right? And so you would say an after blessing before you say birkat hamazon, before you wash for the hamotzi. That doesn't always happen. Or alternatively, you could just have a little bit that wouldn't require you to have a birkat hamazon, a bracha achrona. But we're going to put that's getting even more technical. And if in this case he didn't recite a bracha achrona first before the meal, you should recite it during the meal. Or if you even after birkat hamazon. So, right, let's say the person forgot to say, right, they had a bite to eat before the meal started. They didn't say a bracha achrona, so they could do it after. So now, again, this case, and I apologize, it is a short but intricate simon, right? So you're having a food before the meal that you're not going to have during the meal, right? So you could have for the meal. He would rule. Many authorities would say you should just say a bracha achrona then there. But let's say you didn't. Let's say, right, you had, I don't know what it is. I'm having trouble with examples today. You have something before the meal that has a different bracha set than during the meal. What are you going to do? So one opinion is you would say that that the Birkat Hamazon doesn't cover it, and you'd say another bracha achrona after. If you did eat or drink before the meal and also ate from that type of food during the meal, gam b'soicha suda. Okay, now this puts you into that halachic doubt which he describes above. Yahadir acher Birkat Hamazon, you should endeavor after saying bracha hamazon le'achol or lishtoit ezed davar, eat or something that would require bracha achrona, v'lorech bracha achrona liftor gam ma she'achal shatza kodem d'sedaim. So his solution is like this: you had something before the meal, then you had it again during the meal. To get out of the halachic doubt, have some after you bench for the meal, and then say bracha achrona. So you see, hear that that idea one more time, right? You had something before the meal that needed a bracha achrona, and a beer. You didn't have any beer during the meal, or I guess any shehakol, anything like that, and now you just had wine during the meal because Doug only serves wine during the meal. So now, after the meal, have a little bit more of the beer and make a bracha achrona. That's one option. It's one option. Now, want to point out that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch here doesn't rule on the question of whether you're obliged to recite a bracha achrona when they've eaten the same type of food during the meals beforehand, whether or not they're foods that require their own bracha rishona when eaten during the meal. But he skips this thing, and one reason might be because he just says you should avoid it altogether. The Mishnah Berurah does offer a ruling in this situation. And he depends, and this is very much how we would do things today. Depends on whether the foods that were eaten during the meal require their own bracha rishona, even when eaten during the meal. Okay, so, right? And that, requires a little bit of explanation. So when the foods would not require their own bracha rishona during the meal, one is required to recite a bracha achrona on the food that they ate earlier. Okay? So let's say it again. According to the Mishnah Berurah, you had some food before the meal. And the foods that were eaten during the meal let me say it again. So if the foods that would require their own bracha rishona during the meal, and the bracha that is recited on these foods before the meal exempts those foods they'll eat during the meal, then the procedure here is unnecessary. Right. I don't know if anybody got that. We'll try to explain it like this. Hopefully we'll get this straight. We're on a case, right, where we're going to have some food during the that food that was eaten during a meal, whether it requires its own bracha rishona or not. And he says like this: when the food eaten during the meal would not require their own bracha rishona during the meal, one's required to say bracha on the food that he ate earlier. So they have something before the meal. If you were to have that during the meal, it wouldn't require its own bracha rishona. You're supposed to say a bracha achrona after the meal. Okay, ready? You had something before the meal that wouldn't require its own bracha during the meal, right? Like if somebody brought you an extra apple during a meal. No, apple's not good. Sorry, it's fruit. Potato. You had a potato before the meal. You didn't say bracha achrona, and you're like, I'll just include it in the meal. The Mishnah Berurah would say that since if that had been brought during the meal, you wouldn't say its own bracha on it because it was covered in birkat hamazon in the hamotzi. So then afterwards, you would say a bracha on it after you said benching. However, if the foods that were brought would require their own bracha rishona during the meal, and the bracha that you recited upon these foods before the meal exempts those foods that would be eaten during the meal, then the procedure here is unnecessary. So now you've got you had a piece of fruit beforehand. If brought during the meal, it would require its own bracha. And the birkat hamazon is going to cover it. Everybody get that? Kinda. I'll say it one more time. According to Mishnah Berurah, you have something before the meal. If you had been brought that thing during the meal, it would not require its own bracha. After the meal, he wants you to make a bracha on that thing you had before the meal. Right? This is a case of just let's maybe I complicated it by saying it was a dinner party. Maybe you just forgot. Maybe you just forgot. You had something before the meal, right? Because a dinner party, maybe for me that worked. Maybe it doesn't work for you. You had something before the meal. Now, during the meal, if you had that same thing, you wouldn't say its own bracha on it. It's covered in the hamotzi. After the meal, you're going to want to, you said birkat hamazon, you bench, you're still going to want to say a bracha achrona, and after bracha, says the Mishnah Berurah, on what you had beforehand. However, if what you had before the meal is something that happened during the meal, you'd have to say its own bracha on it, like an apple, or even better yet, a grape. When you say birkat hamazon at the end of the meal, it's going to cover that thing. Everybody have an awesome